Okay, well, welcome to our community roundtable for conversation across community using narrative to explore membership and belonging in South Dakota. And I am here tonight with my colleagues and collaborators, Dr. Nicole Flynn and Dr. Gar Santos, and my name is Dr. Charity Bassett. And we're also joined with my oral history class, which is a lovely treat, and they've done a lot of work this semester towards this project, and in some ways know more about the project than maybe anybody in the room. So it's lovely to have them here and ready to ask some good questions. So just a little bit about our project. We are using oral history with the hope of conducting at least 100 interviews. We have 44 at the moment, and I know that one of my students is conducting another one tomorrow. So we are almost halfway there to our first benchmark. Over time, we hope to collect hundreds of interviews with people across the state. What we would like to do is collaborate with diverse communities throughout the state and analyze these oral history narratives in relationship with primary sources and artifacts, use the materials to create a series of public discussions and an interactive digital story map to explore the state's complex identity and interconnected residents. We purport that if membership and belonging are dependent upon citizenship, the definition of citizen urgently needs to be interrogated. And we must ask who is included, who is excluded, how and why. And our project's goal, one of our project's goal, is to provide the inhabitants of South Dakota with the knowledge and guidance to ask and answer such difficult and pressing questions in these challenging times, all over, but also in our state. So that's a little bit about the project. We are so excited to have some of the people that we have interviewed for the project here with us tonight, and are very much interested and looking forward to your feedback on some of the things that we've put together with this material thus far. The way that this will be structured this evening is that the three of us have pulled many different themes from the interviews, and we will tell three stories this evening, and they're three very different stories. And so one of the things that we're hoping that you as participants tonight will do is to help us see some connections, intersections among the three stories, to feel free to ask challenging questions of our work. I want to make sure that you all know that this is very much a work in progress, and there's a lot of rough edges, and we all feel a little bit vulnerable coming to the space with our research at this sort of messy stage with frayed edges. And so feel free to really kind of dig into what we've said and ask questions of our work where it stands right now. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Nicole and Christy to introduce yourselves.
Hello, my name is Nicole Flynn. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English at SDSU, and I will leave it at that so we can use our time to share our work with you.
Hello, my name is Christy Gar Santos, and I am the director of the School of American and Global Studies and the PHI, the Public Humanities Initiative, that is co-sponsoring this event along with the South Dakota Humanities Council. And I am a Spanish literature professor by training.
And I'll mention that at the end of our work together here tonight, we have a survey that we'll ask you to fill out. There's an online link for that I'll share at the end. And again, it's just more feedback to help us work through our project and make it as good as it can be. All righty. So we are hoping that what we talk about tonight inspires some of you to either do an interview, do a second interview, or invite people to conduct an interview with us. So we've got our materials here that we can certainly share. And with that, we'll start with Nicole, Dr. Flynn.
Thank you. So the theme that I want to draw out of 3 of the interviews that we have already conducted is connecting through the arts. So I want to introduce you briefly to these 3 narrators and share their thoughts about art as a language that can bridge divides. So Caitlin has lived in South Dakota for 15 years now. It's the longest she's ever lived anywhere, but she calls herself, rather than a South Dakotan, she considers herself a citizen of the world. She homeschools her children because she wants them to be, in her words, examiners. She wants them to think for themselves. And she has been producing each summer a Shakespearean play acted in by her homeschool group, about 12 to 30 high school students. And this was something she felt very passionate about, very excited about. People have really expressed how impressive this is, that she got students in 1 week to memorize their lines and perform Shakespeare. And I think these 2 things, even though she didn't explicitly relate them, are related. This idea of being an examiner and a citizen of the world, and drama, because drama is inherently an art form that brings people together, people on stage, people in the audience, and you literally give voice to another person's life. You embody them, you speak their language, you inhabit their position in the world for a period of time. And I think this, especially doing Shakespeare, you're speaking with another voice across time and space. Okay? And one thing that Caitlin said about South Dakota and about the kind of polarization that she has experienced in this state, she said, I don't think anybody really benefits from living in an echo chamber, irrespective of whether or not I agree with the ideas in the echo chamber. And when we asked her about her hope for the future of the state, she said, my hope would be that we could embrace rather than drive out diverse voices. Okay? And I contend that she is doing that work with her homeschool group on the ground by staging these plays every year and then sending those students out into the world. The second interviewee that I want to talk about is Mackenzie. Mackenzie came to South Dakota from a family farm in Minnesota to study animal science and ag business at SDSU. She's a recent graduate. And an internship that she had with Project Help forged a connection for her with the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, and also with the western part of the state more broadly. After a bad horse accident that nearly took her life while she was in college, she had a kind of epiphany. And these are her words here, that really made me reevaluate my life and the people I wanted in my life. And it really made me see who was there for me. And it marked a real turning point in sort of the path her life was following. She broke off an engagement, and she, through Project Help, applied to a photography workshop to work out west, West River, with a professional photographer and 9 other students. And as she says in this second bullet point here, photography's kind of been my little escape from reality. It's It's where I can be myself, and I get to meet so many new cool people and just photograph what I feel. Okay. So for Mackenzie, I think the art form of photography helped her see the world that she thought was beautiful, to see the world that reflected her emotions and helped her express that to the world and to share that with other people. And it logistically helps and continues to help her encounter people at the state fair, as she travels, as she tries to recruit people to come to South Dakota. It's both the vehicle for her meeting others and for also opening herself up to connection with those people. And finally, I want to talk about MD. His family, his mother's family, have lived in South Dakota for a long time. He grew up in Aberdeen. He went to North Dakota State for college to study criminal justice. And he came back, in his words, with dreams of becoming a musician. So had a little change of heart also while he was in school. He's set on transforming Sioux Falls, where he lives now, from a music entertainment destination to what he calls a music cultivator. And when he was describing the process of getting his business off the ground and writing his music and touring with it, performing it, he said it was difficult at first, that it was sometimes hard to get booked and to overcome what he called negative stigma. And again, although he didn't make this explicit connection, I inferred in our conversation that this was based on his race. He's an African-American man writing and performing music. And he said people would see them come on stage and assume they were going to play rap music, even though this was not the style of music that they performed at all. But in his words, we got a chance to see a lot of things I never thought I'd get to see, and meet a lot of people I never thought I'd get to meet. And it was all because of art, because of music. So really for him, this is a way to connect with others, to share something that he loves, and he wants to draw talented, young, creative people to the state. And then finally, he said, it's like, talking about music, the highest form of nonverbal communication you can have. And it just kind of, for some reason, brings people's differences to the table, and people just accept it, And then he paused. He said, I guess more forget about it. So for him, music was not only a chance to encounter others, but it was a chance to talk to them in a language that could overcome difference, that it was a richer and more emotional connection, a kind of language that sought what people have in common and helped them let go of the differences because something else more important superseded it. And, certainly this is a very optimistic view, to me, a lovely view. And ultimately, what I learned from drawing out this theme is that it perhaps models what we can do with this project, and how we can present the different voices that we've collected, put them in conversation with each other, and share them with others through the arts, through drama or music or photography or other forms of art, to open up space within people to hear these different stories.
Excuse me. Whew.
Thank you so much. Okay. And now for something entirely different. Turn two. Alrighty. So I'm so excited to see Laura here because I open my discussion with Laura's interview, which Nicole Flynn conducted. So I'm looking at 2 interviews. I'm putting 2 interviews in conversation. And Laura is a Lakota and Dakota woman, and Amy is a Lakota woman. And one of my students, Sierra, actually did the interview with Amy. And it was a lovely interview. Both of these were really so interesting to both watch and put into conversation with one another. So what I am kind of looking at with Laura's interview is this piece in here where she's talking about her culture and where she can go to locate knowledge about her culture and how some of that is siloed into specific places in the state. And also this misconception that she hears from people in the state and her relatives and family members and community members here, which is this idea that Indians get free healthcare. When in truth, this healthcare is in exchange for land, millions and millions of land, of acres of land. So treaties often stipulated that professionals such as physicians, educators would come serve reservations in exchange for this land. So this is an exchange, a government to government exchange on paper. Of course, there's all kinds of ways in which one of those governments, sets of governments gets the short end of the stick for sure. And so I thought it would be interesting to kind of crack open that myth, Indians get free healthcare, by looking at the interview with Amy, where she does discuss the really complicated nature of what that healthcare, that free healthcare actually looks like and what it means. So healthcare provided through Indian Health Services is not meeting the needs of American Indian peoples, especially during the time of COVID. This is what comes out in her interview. And pointing to some of the historical trauma around Indian Health Services. Indian Health Services has a history of systematic sterilization of Indigenous women in the 1960s and 1970s. And recently, because not too long ago, Amy was afraid to have a child until 25 for fear of having her tubes tied against her will. And Sierra and Amy, who are related, have family narratives of family members dying because of negligence and misdiagnoses from Indian Health Services. So these are kind of the 2 things I'm putting together. And I want to really thank Danielle Arpan and Jonathan Miklos for their help in this research. Okay, so these pieces about Indian Health Services not meeting the needs of American Indian people, what's going on there? So here I'm putting together a piece of the interview between Sierra and Amy, and the secondary source, American Indian Health Policy, Historical Trends and Contemporary Issues by Warren and Frizzle from 2014. So this little piece of interview, Sierra says, earlier you mentioned that the IHS is killing us. Can you speak more to that statement? And Amy says, treaty obligation is healthcare, education, and land. IHS is a system created by the US government to placate us, to say that they're offering healthcare when at best they're offering subpar third world healthcare facilities. And this is certainly backed up by the work of Warren and Frizzle, who conclude in their article that Indian Health Services budget held in the US Department of Health and Human Services has not kept pace with medical inflation. And we know that medical inflation, right, that has occurred, and the increase of American Indian and Alaska Native populations. Long-term underfunding of the IHS is a contributing factor to AIAN health disparities. And then furthermore, the amount of needless suffering and loss of life related to preventable and treatable illness makes IHS, funding a matter of social justice and civil rights. And so I don't have a whole lot of time to go into kind of the nuts and bolts of IHS, but I will say that earlier today, Danielle and I looked into just how many facilities there are in the US and where they're located. And there are 162 facilities located in the United States that range from like a wellness center to a hospital. But just because you hear IHS does not mean that there's full comprehensive healthcare that happens there. So that's something I definitely want to explore further. So this is a piece of Amy's narrative, and I will just read it. IHS killed my aunt. They misdiagnosed cancer in her, and by the time they were able to find it, she was so sick that they were able to name it as pancreatic cancer, but she had been telling them those exact same symptoms. For a year and a half, my aunt was given different advice on changing her diet and doing different things, but it was pancreatic cancer. My dad had cancer and was dying and was on palliative care, and they forgot to put notes in his file. And so he was getting fluid built up in his stomach and getting super uncomfortable and couldn't eat. I went back to the hospital and started calling, and I'm like, where's the referral to go to get the fluid removed from his stomach? And somebody had just forgotten to note it. I just did a complaint on it and nothing happened. She still works there, the doctor that did it. And we all have a story of somebody that we know that IHS misdiagnosed, didn't diagnose, or mistreated, something that was detrimental to the point of like amputations or life lost or lifelong disability, debilitating conditions. So again, kind of looking back at Laura's statement, American Indians get free healthcare. Well, it's much more complicated than that. So one of the things that shifts and changes about the IHS happens during the self-determination period of the United States because of a lot of activism that's happening by American Indian people in the 1960s and 1970s. So this act that Nixon signed into law, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which is also called the Public Law 93-638. And I'm just now learning this, but this number 638 is pretty important because it's 638 contracts are something that tribal nations can contract with the United States government to have more autonomy over things like healthcare. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But this Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act not only applies to healthcare, but broadly to matters concerning the tribes, including construction, healthcare, any other services given from the federal government, although that word given, right, needs to be understood as an exchange. The goal of the bill is for tribal nations to have greater autonomy by dictating how their people would be better served, allocating resources on a tribal nation by tribal nation basis instead of a blanket policy from Washington. So I really need to look into this more, but from what I understand right now, it looks like funding functions fairly similarly, that the funding is still being held by the US government. But once that funding is allocated through a 638 contract, there is more autonomy that tribal nations have. So again, this is from Amy. She's talking about these contracts, and she says, the 638 independent contract healthcare facilities are just taking the resources or the allocations of the money that were given to the tribes and building a system that works for us, using those resources, and then being able to apply for other resources. I really believe in the power and the genius of our people and the ability to create these systems. I watch it happen every day at work, and change like this is slow, but I see it steadily. Pushing all of the time and changing the conditions of the world that we live in, it's right in front of us. IHS is just one of the ways that treaty obligations aren't being met, and the government continues to try to erase us. And so one example of one of these 638 contract healthcare facilities is right in Rapid City, in the northern part of Rapid City. And Amy talked a little bit about this facility. It's called the Oyate Health Center. And so even though there are, well, I won't get too much into that. It doesn't matter at this point. So the Oglala, Cheyenne River, and Rosebud tribal nations contracted together with the US government to put this, this facility in place. So I wasn't sure if 638 facilities had to be on reservation or off reservation, and clearly they can be off reservation. So across the board, 86%, there's an 86% reduction of wait times for healthcare with these contracts. And then from the website of the Oyate Health Center, since 1975, the Harvard Project for Native American Development notes that communities that have taken full advantage of this program have seen improvements in nearly every socioeconomic marker. The goal is to establish a care setting where our patients have the greatest chance at improving their overall health. This approach has proven to be successful, and we are excited to have the opportunity to apply it at the Oyate Health Center. And I'll just conclude by saying, I think it's really fascinating what these oral history narratives can do, the spaces that they open up, the questions that they open up, because I mean, I've lived here for 4 years now. It's the first time I've heard something like a 638 contract. I have done a little bit of inquiry into Indian health services prior to being in South Dakota, but it's just really interesting to see how this plays out at the state level, and interesting to see how these narratives are what lead us to look into these questions.
So I'm going to switch gears once again, and the title that I've given my story for this evening is Cultural Code: The Limits of Midwest Nice. And you know, if I'm signposting where I will take this research in the future, or where we as a team will take this research in the future, is that one thing that has come up over and over again, really across the oral histories that we've done, is this concept of Midwest nice in some way or another. And folks tend to talk about how South Dakotans, you know, there's a real sense of community here. Neighbors help neighbors. It's a very friendly place. And so we will, once we have collected all of the oral histories and have our transcripts, one of the things that we will do is a digital scrub, so that we can see how frequently this concept is coming up within narratives, but also across narratives. And so the first two histories that I'm going to put into conversation this evening are Scott and Garrett. And Scott and Garrett were our alumni of South Dakota State University. I believe that they graduated around 2015. And both men identify as gay men. And so there was something that Scott said that really caught my eye, and thus, you know, the after the colon there, what are these limits of Midwest nice? And so I'll just read this piece from Scott. And when I asked him if he considered himself a South Dakotan, he said he did, and it was because he was very kind and courteous. And he says, you know, I think South Dakotans present a very courteous, kind exterior, which can be off-putting. I would say that for me, being a queer person, especially in South Dakota, you can quickly learn that this kind exterior doesn't necessarily extend much further. I think that sometimes South Dakotans, not to generalize too much, but they can kind of use this veneer of kindness and, you know, niceness to hide or conceal the underlying bigotry, or just kind of a way to dehumanize people in a way that they find acceptable. And Garrett really echoed that and put what I'm now thinking of as Midwest nice as a paradox, right? So he really calls out this paradox throughout his oral history interview. And what Garrett said when asked about being a South Dakotan, he said, yep, on my best and worst days. And so when he was asked to talk about his best, what he meant by his best days, again, he said, when I'm kind and patient, and worse, when I am naive and abrupt. And so that paradox that he lays out for us is this concept of South Dakotans or South Dakotan identity as both this really lovely collective, communal identity, but also this really selfish or individualistic identity. And when asked to expand on that a bit, he said, well, you live in the middle of nowhere because you want to live in the middle of nowhere. You don't want other people to mess with you. But in that same vein, if you're in a small town, you have no one else to help you but the people next to you. And I should point out that both Scott and Garrett have since left the state, in part because of their inability to find community as gay men in South Dakota. And so, but they both talked really positively about, again, this paradox of but yet especially when they were at SDSU and they both became members of the Gay Straight Alliance, and they both came out in college, and they had that real sense of community and found family. And they also miss that sense of community that they grew up with, of neighbor helping neighbor, and their own neighborhoods or immediate towns being this sort of very communal space that they miss now living in big cities. So on this next slide, I got to thinking, you know, is there any research that's been done? And when I looked into it, lo and behold, Paul Renfro, who's a psychologist at Cambridge University, he was part of a research team, I believe there were 3 or 4 of them, that gathered data from 1.5 million people. So it was a very robust study of regions and personalities in the United States. And this was done over the period of a decade. And so at the end of that decade, with their 1.5 million people, participants, they did find that, so we can cluster the United States in really 3 clusters. And that first cluster is friendly and conventional. And South Dakota is right there in that friendly and conventional region. The second cluster is relaxed and creative. That's mostly the West Coast and parts of the East Coast. And then the third is temperamental and uninhibited. And that is largely the Upper East Coast, some bits of the South. And so for our purposes here, we're going to use journalist Paul Kick's definition of Midwest nice. And he said, it's this understanding that you should be kind to people regardless of the circumstance, and that you should suppress any urge to speak ill of anybody. And this goes along with what Renfro and his colleagues found, is that sure enough, it is this paradox of a group of people who are high in extroversion and low in openness, and meaning that South Dakotans tend to be very sociable, very talkative, but they're not perhaps particularly curious to difference or open to new ideas. And so we have this contradiction of, I'm going to be very nice to you, but I may be uncomfortable with your difference, and I don't really know how to address that. And so that can come off as Scott was saying, you know, sometimes covering over these more negative feelings. So on this next slide, and I got to thinking, you know, well, what does that look like in terms of culture? And Scott actually made the connection at the end of his interview when he said, I would like to know more about Native American communities in our state. And that brings me back to that concept of veneer that we have. I think we have a veneer of quote unquote appreciating Native American cultures, but you know, I don't remember learning anything about them really in any of my schools. And this reminded me of an interview that I did with Carla. And it was really fascinating to me because again, if we're looking at those limits of Midwest Nice, and especially when it comes to race and ethnicity, there does seem to be, I don't know if I want to call it a breaking of that code, or again, if it's just that paradox that we're seeing. But what Carla said was, and Carla was a reverse, so she had a reverse migration. She came to South Dakota from California. And what she said was, I did find a lot of very friendly people here. I know that people, they're very opinionated and they're very good at expressing their opinion. Here, people talk more about politics than they do in California. And I found this really curious because most of the South Dakotans I know, and certainly my students, never want to talk about politics. Again, it's that Midwest Nice code, right? But Carla went on to say, they'll ask me things like, so what do you think about the election being rigged? It's a very, very slippery slope, especially because my skin color is definitely different than theirs. Sometimes it can turn into a little bit of racial debates. And then she gave an example of that. And she told a story of somebody who came into her place of work. And she said, are you Mexican or are you Native? And I said, oh, I'm Mexican, ma'am. And she asked me, I have a question, but don't get offended. How come whenever Mexicans come over to the US, they just can't learn English? And so again, we have this, if we go to the next slide, the research is playing out what we're seeing or maybe supporting what we're seeing in these interviews. And I found it really fascinating. John Lauk, who is a Midwest historian, he actually is an adjunct professor at USD. He's written several books on the area. And he has traced Midwest Nice back to this concept or to our roots as an agrarian society. So a key component of agrarian society is a high level of cooperation, or what historians call mutuality, or to put it in plain English, having a barn raising culture. And he goes on to explain that in the 1800s, this region was very diverse, not necessarily in racial makeup, but in terms of national origin, language, and religion. It was one of the most diverse regions in the country. And so what really mattered if folks were to get along was to be nice and friendly, but not necessarily too inquisitive or critical of those differences. And so this is something that we're kind of now, or I'm sort of playing around with in my own research area, is what has happened now that those differences are playing out in terms of race and ethnicity, and how are we seeing Midwest Nice either shift or perhaps just play out that paradox that that Renfro and his colleagues found. So I will end it there.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm gonna stop my share here. And at this point, we'd like to turn it over to you and hear your thoughts, reflections, questions. We're very curious. Carla, please.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say thank you to all of you for bringing me here and bringing this to light. It actually opened my eyes into something very different. Like, wow, that is true, because I myself have experienced that whole like Midwestern nice, but if it's different from like my concept of my world. And I understand, I mean, organizing schemas is how we kind of organize the world. But I think sometimes when you find something different, it's like, is there like a line between saying, I don't want to be rude and ask, or is it just kind of out of my schema, out of my scope? So, I mean, all of this just kind of, for me, was very interesting. And I'm like, oh, wait, yeah, I've seen that before. I've heard it before, So thank you for all of this as well.
Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Yes, I was very happy to see your name.
And if you'd prefer to type the question in chat, feel free.
Okay.
And Carla, I would say that, so I just got this book. It's called Latino Heartland. And Suhe Vega. It's a look at specifically Spanish-speaking immigrants and long-term residents as well, right? Specifically in Indiana, and she is looking at this concept that, you know, those questions of, I don't mean to be rude or don't be offended, really plays with that Midwest nice of being very sociable and you know, I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to be friendly, and this is how a way that I know how to do that. But yet it, as Scott pointed out, kind of masks that underlying at times downright animosity or racism, but sometimes also just an unfamiliarity with difference.
Yeah, I do notice that sometimes in my places of work, or even here in the Midwest, people are almost afraid to ask me specifically. And I always know the question, you know, what race are you or what nationality? And it's almost like they're afraid to ask. So it's like they kind of, I know that they're trying to find a way around it. You know, it's like when they say something like, "Oh, where are you from?" That's usually the question. And I'm trying to get them to ask me the question, because it's like, I'm telling you, it's okay to ask me. It's okay to have that conversation with me. I am a safe person to have those conversations with. But still, it's almost like I want to ask her what nationality she is or what race, but I just don't want to ask her. You know?
Yeah.
So we have a question from a student for all three of us. What has been your favorite part of the project, and has there been a particular interview or moment? Nicole.
Muted. It's hard to pinpoint one particular place, but I'll say for me, this project is sort of my first public humanities project, and it's my first time working with a research team. And I think that structure really lends itself beautifully to this kind of project, because from the very beginning, it was many voices coming together and many minds coming together. And the three of us are all very different scholars. And to see how this has grown and developed, and with each interview, I feel like it's grown from there too. And these three themes we pulled out were nothing that we'd explicitly talked about before, or that had even necessarily occurred to us until we sat down and looked at them more carefully. So I'm just really excited to see what continues to grow out of this and what direction it takes us.
I think what I've enjoyed, one of the things I've enjoyed the most about this is conducting the interviews in a state that I'm new to, because nothing in my 4 years has connected me to the state in the same way as hearing from individuals about their connection to this place. I'm living very vicariously through others' connection to the state, and that's been a lot of fun. And I will echo what Nicole says, that we have 3 different areas of research, and it's really fun to see what we're gravitating towards and how those things might intersect and tell a broader story.
Yeah, I would echo both of those things. And, Charity talks about how they've connected her to the state being relatively new. But I would say I got the same, one of the things that I've enjoyed most is that I've been in the state for quite a while. I've been in the state for almost 20 years. And I feel like I know the state in a different way now. There were some pretty specific communities. I had done some extensive outreach work with Spanish-speaking migrants, refugees, asylum seekers in the state. But getting to hear all of these stories has been really cool. And really from, whether it's from long-term white South Dakotans who have told us about century family farms, to our indigenous communities, and really hearing their voices, I think, in ways that we don't often hear in the media in the state. And so it's just been really interesting to see all of those voices from across the state, and to be able to put them into conversation, which, one thing that we led the one of our primary statements, I guess, or hypotheses when we started, was that this state is and has always been diverse. But seeing that come through in the research has been lovely.
Mhm. So we've got a question from a student, and I know that Dr. Garsantos is going to want to start with this. How do you all overcome any language barriers in the state, or has this not been an issue yet?
How do we overcome language barriers in the state?
Or has this not been an issue yet? Maybe we can talk about our approach to language. Sorry.
Yeah. I was going to say specifically to this project, or?
Yeah, and maybe we can just broaden that out a little bit to talk about our approach to language.
Yeah, so we have posted flyers in Spanish, French, and actually Amharic, which is the language of Ethiopia. There is a large refugee migrant community or refugee community in Sioux Falls. We also have offered interviews in Lakota, Dakota Spanish. So basically our approach has been, participants can tell their story in any language they wish, and we will find a translator for that transcript afterwards. We may not be able to conduct the interview in that particular language, but when we can, we do. So we have tried to be as inclusive as possible. We have had some participants who have told their stories in Lakota and Dakota, even though the interview was conducted in English. And that's been exciting. Yeah, would you want to add anything, Sherry or Nicole?
Yeah, I would just say that in order to access the kinds of stories that we're hoping to access and tell the rich story that we're trying to tell, we had to approach it through a multilingual approach as best as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Christy, what is that point of data that Dr. Volan shared about the Constitution of South Dakota being written in several languages anyway?
Yes. So along the way, as we were researching this, one of our colleagues pointed us to a source that pointed out that the South Dakota Constitution, when it was voted on to ratify it, they actually circulated it in newspapers of the day in 4 different languages. So English, and then I think they said Scandinavian, right? Is that right?
Yes.
And then German, and what's the 4th one? I'm forgetting.
Russian.
Oh,
Russian.
yes, that's right.
But at any rate, we found this really fascinating because some of what has also come up along the way were the debates that the state has been having about, could we even have people take their driver's license exam in Spanish, for example, or there has been a couple of attempts and to have English as the official language of the state. And so just looking at that historical shift, right, when at its root, at its inception, at its origin, South Dakota was multilingual. And certainly if we go back even farther and think of the Ocheti Shakoi, right? The 7 tribal councils and the languages that were spoken at those councils, always been multilingual. And so now, you know, we're getting into, we're seeing a shift, let's say.
So Noah, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, please go ahead.
Yeah. So Dr. Garsantos, when you brought up John Locke's work, that struck a connection to my family history. Bulgarians and Germans that came here between turn of the century and the world wars, at times when you did not want to be Bulgarian or German in the US. And what that resulted in was the later generations not learning that language and that culture disappearing in my family. And to me, that's an abject failure. And displays a historical precedence of ignoring or erasing difference in the Midwest. And the way I see it, we are at another precipice where we have a large wave of people coming from different places. Latin America, as you mentioned, Ethiopia. How do we avoid doing that again? How do we break that precedent of assimilation and grow the South Dakotan or Midwestern curiosity in difference?
That is really the $20 million question.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the driving forces of our research project is, you know, one of our hopes is that if we can open up this space and create a place where we can have these conversations across communities. And as you point out, Noah, really look at the history of the state, right? Because I think oftentimes we don't know that. I mean, I didn't know that the South Dakota Constitution was circulated in multiple languages. And so really try and grapple with what does that mean and what does that mean about us as a state, as an identity. But then also by telling these stories in multiple languages across multiple cultures, hopefully we can break down some of that fear of difference or resistance to difference and humanize people, right?
Thank you.
And if I could respond, I just noticed Dustina and Becky's comments in the chat, I think connects to this, that, you know, Dustina mentioned that experiences will vary depending on the demographics of the state, and also depending on it because of the geography of the state. You know, we have a very large space. It changes a great deal as you go across it, and people are quite spread out. And you know, Becky was asking about the local enclaves and the local newspapers, and I think that's absolutely part of it. That at the time in the 19th century, local newspapers in the language of the community was a great way to disseminate information. That doesn't work the same way anymore, right? So part of what we're trying to figure out is how can we access these people across language barriers, across physical barriers, across ideological barriers, right? What is the medium for that connection? And practically speaking, how do we get everyone on the same page about what the best steps are to move forward?
Yeah,
Natasha has a hand up.
Oh,
Dustina, I don't know if you wanted to.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dustina.
Hi, I'm tuning in over from Siston area. One thing we noticed, I live on the Lake Traverse Reservation. Lived here basically my whole life. We know if we go to a college town like Brookings, Fargo, we know there's more, it's safer, there's more tolerance to people of color. And it's because there's college students there's people there from different places, versus if we went to a rural town, West River, South Dakota, or a reservation border town along one of the reservations in South Dakota. There's not such polite racism. It's just, I don't know, if you're gonna go to Rapid City, you put enough gas in your car so you don't have to stop anywhere. And if you do, then it has to be at a busy gas station where there's other tourists because things happen. It's just it's the fact of being brown and living in South Dakota.
I think that really importantly points to the fact that there's no one South Dakota either, right? And there's not two South Dakota. It's not just broken down to East River, West River, but this is a complex set of spaces and a complex set of relationships. Thank you, Dustina. And then, yeah, Laura. Oh, did somebody have their hand up?
Natasha did.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry, Natasha.
Hi, I'm just out for a walk. I just listening, but I just had a couple comments with the connection. Since I am Native, my mom pointed out to me that I look Hispanic yesterday, but because I was talking to her about kind of the things I struggled with in college and school and stuff like that. And I left college. I left the state for college, and I'm going to be leaving the state again for grad school because I didn't feel I got a lot of opportunity here for me. And I think the sentiment of going back to bringing in the historical aspect of connection of these ethnics, because my biggest thing is that the new immigrants are not going to learn, like the word South Dakota, Dakota is for indigenous people that are still here. And I think they kind of think that with the recent thing of Rick Storm said that there was no Native American culture in American culture. It was mostly based off the Iroquois Democratic nation on the East Coast. And I just found out, I did a little family tree project this summer before the pandemic that half of my maternal side is English, and they were from New York City, and he came here with the American Fur Company and in the 1820s. Mm-hmm. And he fell in love with a Native American woman, I think Eagle woman that is in the South Dakota Hall of Fame. So I think back then, for me, spiritually, there's people that have their own karma and their own purpose. But I think as a collective and a group, I think it has to be addressed of historically what I'm welcoming. I just don't want to be forgotten and eliminated by other people of color. Mm-hmm. And because when I interacted with people, I had a really weird I'm an only child, so I analyze every encounter that I have with people. So sometimes I don't think they kind of really understand our struggle or our where we came from or what we had to deal with, or how our generations have struggled and overcome, and we're still doing that. And then and I think the second point, what Laura said, there is safety in certain cities and reservation towns. Like I haven't been to the West River for a very long time. And I remember that I filled up gas at Myrtle, and this guy, I had my dog with me, and he came up behind me, and my dog barked at him. He got scared. He's like, "Oh, I'm sorry." But he didn't really think of anything about it. Like it seemed like he was allowed to do that. Mm-hmm. And it was late at night, and, I just pulled off at, the exit at I-90 to fill up gas. So I think what I've noticed for the past year, I think there's a lack of personal awareness. I think there's an echo chamber. I think for me, I'm just now noticing it too with people I went to high school with. And when you do point it out or cause, there is a defensiveness, and they're like, so to me, I have to kind of, I wouldn't be open to sharing. I would get like not that open to sharing, like, where are you from? Like, what do you mean? Why are you saying that to me? You know, like, I don't know you, you're a stranger. So, but yeah, I wouldn't be open to any of that kind of conversation right now, just because there's just so much things that I went through the last 2020 here in Sioux Falls and everything like that. So, but I think that's all I have to say, I think. So,
Thank you so much for sharing that, Natasha.
yeah. All right.
Appreciate it. Appreciate you being
Bye.
here. Bye. Enjoy your walk.
Bye. Thank you.
So at this point, we are at 7 o'clock. I'm happy to stay on if people have further discussion and questions, but I do want to respect the time. We have put a survey, an online survey into the chat. If you would please take a minute to fill that out, it would really help serve our project. And I would like to give special thanks to the Public Humanities Initiative at SDSU and to the South Dakota Humanities Council for supporting this pretty amazing project that we're just getting started. We're just getting started. So be on the lookout for more of what we're up to. I'm also going to put the link to the sign up for interviews into the chat if you are interested in doing an interview or a second interview or sharing it with others. And Christy and Nicole, if you have any closing thoughts.
Yeah,
I just wanted to clarify that, that the survey is actually from the South Dakota Humanities Center and it goes directly to them. So that they graciously are funding our project, and in exchange, we will give them this feedback on tonight. And yes, feel free to reach out to any of us, our first name, last name at SD State, if you have any questions. We just loaded a few more slots into our Sign Up Genius for interviews, and we'd love to talk to any of you, especially if we haven't already had the chance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I would just say, yes, please stay tuned. I did see a question, will you be sharing additional narratives? And we absolutely will in the future. We have applied for an NEH grant that if we receive that, as well as some additional grants, our hope is that this will actually be an exhibit in Sioux Falls at the Washington Pavilion. It would be a multimedia project. You would be able to interact and listen to some of these narratives. That actually will happen with or without the NEH grant. Please stay tuned and take a look at our Conversation SD website. We will be eventually uploading the narratives there, those that we have permission to do so. And so you'll be able to peruse the archive, listen to these stories. I think Nicole just shared it in the chat. So this project will live on. We are only at the inception.
Yeah, and with that, thank you so much for being here. And if you do want to stick around and ask any questions, go ahead and unmute and let them rip.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.